Life had settled into its quiet rhythm when my world first began to unravel. The days felt ordinary, predictable even, and I took comfort in that. Emily and I had been married for 10 years, a milestone I thought reflected not just love but mutual respect and understanding. We had a good life, a cozy house in the suburbs, 2 kids who filled our days with laughter and chaos, and a shared vision of growing old together, or so I thought. The first crack in the facade came not from Emily but from my mother. She was a straight-talking woman, her wisdom honed by years of experience and an uncanny ability to see through people. She called one evening, her voice steady but tinged with something that made my stomach tighten. "Are you sitting down?" she asked. I chuckled, thinking it was one of her dramatic preludes to some harmless gossip. "What's up, Mom?" Her pause was too long, and when she finally spoke, the weight of her words hit like a freight train. "I saw Emily today, but she wasn't alone. She was at that little cafe downtown, holding hands with a man who wasn't you." My immediate reaction was disbelief. Emily, my Emily, would never. She loved me, loved our children, loved the life we'd built. But my mother's voice carried no hint of exaggeration or malice. She wasn't one for baseless accusations. "Are you sure?" I managed to ask, my throat dry. "I wish I wasn't," she said, and her voice softened. "I'm sorry, son, but I thought you should know." That night I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions and scenarios, each more painful than the last. Could there be a logical explanation? A misunderstanding? But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to take root. I decided to confront Emily, but not without evidence. If my mother had misread the situation, I needed to know before I turned our lives upside down. So, I waited and watched, a silent observer in my own marriage. Over the following weeks, I began noticing things I'd once dismissed. Emily had always been a creature of habit, her routines as predictable as the sunrise. But now, she seemed distracted, her phone always within arm's reach, and her laughter a little too forced when I cracked a joke. She'd started working late more often, claiming deadlines and meetings that didn't exist before. One evening, after she kissed me goodbye and headed out for another supposed meeting, I decided to follow her. It felt wrong, invasive, but the gnawing suspicion had become unbearable. I trailed her car at a safe distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. She parked outside a boutique hotel downtown, the kind of place we used to stay at for romantic weekend getaways before life got too busy. A man was waiting for her. He was tall, well-dressed, and he greeted her with a familiarity that made my chest tighten. They embraced, and I saw her face light up in a way that I hadn't seen in years. My heart sank as they disappeared inside. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, my mind a storm of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. When I finally drove home, it was as if I were on autopilot. The house felt colder, emptier, even though nothing had changed. Emily returned later that night, her smile warm but hollow, her excuses rehearsed. I said nothing. Not yet. The next day I confided in my best friend, Mark. He was my sounding board, the person who'd known me long enough to cut through my defenses. When I told him about Emily and what I'd seen, he didn't sugarcoat his advice. "You need to confront her, but do it calmly. If she's lying, you'll know." That evening I tried. I asked Emily about her day, about work, about anything that might lead her to confess. But she was an expert deflector, her answers smooth and practiced. It was clear she had no intention of telling me the truth. So I took another approach. While she was in the shower, I accessed her phone. My hands trembled as I navigated her messages, her photos, her calendar. And there it was, a string of texts with the man from the hotel. His name was Alex, and their conversations left no room for doubt. They'd been seeing each other for months, stealing moments and weaving a web of lies that ensnared us all. The confrontation wasn't the dramatic scene I'd imagined. I waited until the kids were asleep, then laid the evidence on the table, literally. Her phone open to the messages, her calendar with its fabricated meetings. Emily's face went pale, her usual composure crumbling in an instant. She didn't deny it. Instead, she cried, her apologies spilling out in a torrent. She claimed she'd felt lonely, disconnected, that Alex had been a distraction, a mistake. But her words felt hollow, her remorse too little, too late. I told her I needed time to think, to process what had happened. She begged me to stay, to forgive her, but I couldn't. Not yet. I packed a bag and left, seeking refuge at my mother's house. She welcomed me with open arms, her strength a lifeline in the storm. Weeks turned into months as Emily and I navigated the aftermath. Therapy sessions were tense and unproductive, her pleas for forgiveness clashing with my lingering anger and distrust. I wasn't sure if our marriage could survive, and a part of me didn't want it to. Then came the twist I never saw coming. One evening, as I was sorting through old photos, I found a letter tucked inside an album. It was from Emily, written years ago, long before Alex entered the picture. In it, she confessed to struggling with feelings of inadequacy, a feeling like she'd lost herself in the roles of wife and mother. She'd written it during a particularly tough time but had never shown me, afraid of burdening me with her insecurities. The letter didn't excuse her actions, but it offered a glimpse into the pain she'd been carrying alone. It forced me to confront my own shortcomings, the ways I'd failed to see her struggles, to be the partner she needed. In the end, we chose to separate, not out of anger but understanding. The love we once shared had been real, but it had eroded over time, buried under unspoken fears and unmet needs. Emily moved out, and we worked to co-parent our children with as much grace as we could muster. Life moved on, slowly and painfully, but it moved. And in the quiet moments, I found a strange sense of peace. Not every story ends with reconciliation or revenge. Sometimes, the unexpected ending is simply learning to let go, to find closure in the chaos and start anew. Time has a strange way of stretching when you're living under the shadow of suspicion. Each passing day felt like a marathon. Every interaction with Emily loaded with subtext that neither of us acknowledged, but both silently acknowledged in our own ways. Her smiles seemed tighter, her laughter hollow. And as much as I wanted to chalk it all up to stress or an overactive imagination, my gut refused to let it go. It was relentless, gnawing at the edges of my mind like a persistent splinter that wouldn't let me rest. I began noticing the changes in Emily with growing clarity. She'd always had a way of balancing her roles with finesse. A loving wife, a doting mother, and a dedicated professional. But lately, that balance seemed off-kilter. She started coming home later than usual, citing back-to-back meetings or deadlines she'd somehow never mentioned before. Her wardrobe shifted subtly, with new outfits appearing that didn't quite fit her usual style. She claimed it was part of a work-related overhaul, a need to appear more polished in meetings with clients, but it felt like an answer she'd rehearsed. Then there was the phone. It had become her constant companion, always within arm's reach. If it wasn't in her hand, it was face down on the counter or tucked away in her bag. Emily had never been one to hide her screen when she got a text or stepped out of the room to take a call. But now these small, seemingly insignificant behaviors took on a weight that was impossible to ignore. And when I asked her about it, casually, carefully, she laughed it off, calling me paranoid or teasing me about reading too many mystery novels. But paranoia and mystery novels didn't explain the growing distance between us. The quiet moments we used to share, the late-night conversations about our dreams and fears, had been replaced by a silence that felt more like a wall. I'd sit next to her on the couch, trying to bridge the gap with a joke or a story from my day, but she'd nod absent-mindedly, her attention elsewhere. I wanted to believe her when she said it was just stress, that she was overwhelmed by the demands of work and parenting. But the seed of doubt my mother had planted refused to stop growing. One night, as I lay awake beside Emily, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, I made a decision. I needed to know the truth, whatever it might be. And if I was wrong, if my fears were unfounded, I'd swallow my pride and apologize for doubting her. But first, I needed answers. The next day, I decided to take action. I started small, asking more questions about her day and her plans, trying to gauge her reactions. Emily was always quick to answer, but her responses felt just a little too polished, her smile a fraction too tight. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep my doubts alive. Then I began to observe her more closely. I paid attention to the little details, the way her tone shifted when she mentioned work, the time she'd glance at her phone and quickly look away, the way she'd stiffen slightly if I asked about her late nights. I even started keeping track of her schedule, comparing the time she said she was at work with the timestamps on her social media posts or the locations of her credit card transactions. Felt invasive, wrong, but I told myself it was necessary. And then came the night I followed her. She'd kissed me goodbye as usual, her bag slung over her shoulder and her phone clutched in her hand. "Don't wait up," she said with a smile, her tone breezy. "This one might run late." I waited 10 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading to the car. My heart pounded as I followed her at a safe distance, every turn and stoplight feeling like a test of my resolve. I told myself I was overreacting, that I'd see her pull into the office parking lot and feel foolish for doubting her. But when she drove past the office and headed downtown, my stomach twisted into knots. She parked outside a boutique hotel, and my breath caught in my throat. I watched as she stepped out of the car, her movements quick and purposeful, and walked toward the entrance. A man was waiting for her, tall, well-dressed, and confident. They embraced, his hand lingering on her back, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Emily's face lit up as she looked at him, a smile I hadn't seen in years. My chest ached as they disappeared through the hotel's revolving doors. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the entrance as if willing them to reappear and offer some kind of explanation. But no explanation could undo what I'd just seen. The weight of it settled over me, suffocating and inescapable. When I finally drove home, the house felt like a stranger's, cold, empty, and uninviting. Emily returned later that night, her smile warm but hollow, her excuses practiced. I said nothing, not yet. The days that followed were a blur of pain and determination. I knew I couldn't confront her without solid proof, so I began to dig deeper. I checked her phone while she was in the shower, scrolling through her messages and photos with shaking hands. There were no obvious red flags, but the absence of anything suspicious felt deliberate, as if she'd gone out of her way to cover her tracks. Then I found the emails. They were buried in a folder labeled work, hidden among mundane exchanges about deadlines and presentations. But these weren't about work. They were from Alex, the man from the hotel, and their contents left no room for doubt. They spoke of stolen moments, secret rendezvous, and a connection that had no place in our marriage. My hands trembled as I read them, the words blurring together as tears filled my eyes. I copied the emails and sent them to myself, needing to preserve the evidence even as it shattered me. My mind raced with questions and scenarios, each more painful than the last. How long had this been going on? Was it just physical, or had she fallen in love with him? And most importantly, why? What had driven her to betray me, to risk everything we'd built together? The answers wouldn't come from speculation. I needed to hear them from Emily, to confront her with the truth and demand an explanation. But as I prepared for that moment, I couldn't shake the fear of what it would mean for our family, our children, and the life we'd worked so hard to create. The night of the confrontation arrived faster than I'd expected. I waited until the kids were asleep, their soft snores a reminder of what was at stake. Emily was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone with a glass of wine in hand. She looked up as I entered, her smile faltering slightly at the look on my face. I placed her phone on the table, the emails open and waiting. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Her eyes widened as she saw the screen, the color draining from her face. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken words. And then, as the truth spilled out and the walls came crashing down, I realized that this was only the beginning of a journey I never wanted to take. The confrontation began with an unbearable silence, the kind that makes the air feel heavy and every second stretch into eternity. Emily's expression morphed from confusion to panic as she saw the emails displayed on her phone, the damning evidence I had meticulously collected. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, just the faint sound of her sharp intake of breath. I waited, letting the silence do what my voice couldn't. She finally broke. The first words out of her mouth weren't an apology or denial but a plea. "Let me explain." The phrase hung in the air, carrying with it the weight of betrayal and a desperate hope to salvage what remained of our marriage. I wasn't ready to make it easy for her. I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter, and gestured for her to continue. Her explanation started as a jumbled mess of excuses. She spoke about feeling unappreciated, about how Alex had listened when she felt unheard, how it had started innocently enough but spiraled into something she never intended. I wanted to scream at her, to ask how she could justify sneaking off to meet another man while claiming to be too busy for her family, but I forced myself to stay quiet and let her unravel. The longer she spoke, the more I realized that her confession wasn't just about her guilt but about her pain, too. The cracks in our marriage that I had been too blind or too complacent to see. When she finished, her face was streaked with tears. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. A mix of regret, fear, and something that might have been love. But the love felt distant, like a ghost of what it used to be. I wanted to believe her, to believe that this could be fixed. But the ache in my chest reminded me of how deeply I'd been wounded. "Why, Alex?" I asked finally, my voice quieter than I expected. She hesitated. "He made me feel seen," she said, her voice trembling. Like I wasn't just a mother or a wife. Like I was still me. Her words cut deeper than the betrayal itself. The idea that I had failed to see her, to make her feel valued, was a weight I hadn't prepared for. But the betrayal wasn't mine to carry alone. She had chosen to act on those feelings, to break our trust rather than confront the issues head-on. The blame wasn't mine alone. The days after that conversation were some of the darkest I've ever experienced. Emily and I agreed to take some time apart to figure out what came next. She stayed in the house for the kids, and I moved in with my mother, whose unwavering support kept me from spiraling completely. She didn't press for details, understanding that I needed space to process what had happened. I spent those days replaying every moment of our marriage in my head, searching for clues I had missed, signs of Emily's unhappiness that I had been too preoccupied to notice. I thought about the late nights at work, the weekends where we barely spoke, the way she had started dressing differently, smiling less. The signs had been there all along, but I'd convinced myself that they were just the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. I'd been wrong. Emily, too, was struggling. She reached out to me through texts and emails, apologizing again and again, promising that she'd do whatever it took to fix things. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. Her words felt hollow, like they were meant more to ease her guilt than to heal the rift between us. I needed time to decide whether I could forgive her, or if I even wanted to. One evening, as I sat in the small room I'd claimed at my mother's house, I got a call from Mark. He'd been my rock through all of this, the one person I could talk to without fear of judgment. He suggested meeting up for a drink, something to pull me out of the endless loop of self-pity and anger. I agreed, if only to escape the suffocating weight of my own thoughts. At the bar, Mark listened patiently as I poured out everything I was feeling. The anger, the sadness, the guilt. He didn't offer cliched advice or tell me what I should do. Instead, he simply said, "You need to figure out what's best for you. Not for Emily, not for the kids. For you." His words stayed with me long after I went home that night. For so long, my focus had been on holding the family together, on making sure the kids didn't feel the impact of what was happening. But Mark was right. I couldn't be a good father or make the right decisions for my family if I wasn't honest with myself about what I needed. Emily and I finally sat down for a serious conversation about our future. The kids were at a friend's house, giving us the privacy we needed to speak freely. I told her how I felt, the pain, the betrayal, the loss of trust that seemed impossible to rebuild. She listened, her eyes filled with tears. But this time, she didn't interrupt or try to defend herself. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right," she said. "Therapy, counseling, anything. I just don't want to lose you." Her sincerity was palpable, but I couldn't ignore the part of me that wondered if it was too late. Could we ever go back to what we were? Or had her betrayal irreparably damaged the foundation of our marriage? We decided to try couples therapy, if only to say we'd done everything we could. The sessions were painful, forcing us to confront truths we'd both avoided for years. Emily opened up about her feelings of invisibility, of losing herself in the roles of wife and mother. I admitted to my own failings, the times I'd prioritized work over our relationship, the ways I'd taken her for granted. For a while, it felt like we were making progress. We began to communicate more openly, to share parts of ourselves that had been buried under years of routine and complacency. But the shadow of her betrayal loomed large, a constant reminder of the trust that had been broken. And as much as I wanted to forgive her, to rebuild what we'd lost, I couldn't shake the fear that it would happen again. The decision to end our marriage didn't come in a single moment. It was the result of countless sleepless nights, endless soul-searching, and a growing realization that some wounds can't be healed. Emily and I both wanted to make it work, but the truth was, we had become two different people, each shaped by the choices we'd made and the pain we'd endured. In the end, we chose to separate. It was a mutual decision, one made with love rather than anger. We agreed to co-parent our children with as much grace and cooperation as possible, to put their needs above our own. And while it was one of the hardest choices I'd ever made, it was also the right one. The day Emily moved out was bittersweet. We hugged in the doorway, both of us crying, both of us knowing that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. As I watched her drive away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Our marriage was over, but our lives weren't. And in that moment, I found a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd both find happiness again. Separately, but stronger for having endured the storm. After Emily moved out, the house felt impossibly quiet. The absence of her presence was like a phantom pain, something I couldn't ignore no matter how much I tried to distract myself. The kids adjusted faster than I expected. Maybe they sensed the underlying tension in the house all along, even if they couldn't articulate it. Or maybe children are just better at adapting to change than we give them credit for. Either way, their resilience gave me hope, even as I struggled to find my footing in this new reality. The first few weeks after the separation were a blur of logistics. Dividing assets, scheduling custody, figuring out how to navigate holidays and birthdays without creating a minefield of emotions. Emily and I communicated through texts and emails, keeping things polite but distant. The raw pain of betrayal was still too fresh for anything more. One night, while scrolling through my phone in bed, I came across a photo of the four of us at the beach last summer. The kids were covered in sand, their faces lit up with joy, while Emily and I stood behind them, arms wrapped around each other. We looked happy, genuine, but as I stared at the image, I couldn't help but wonder how much of that happiness had been real and how much had been a carefully curated facade. Was she already seeing Alex then? Was her mind elsewhere while I stood there, smiling like a fool? The questions were endless, and they ate at me. I knew I needed to stop dwelling on the past, but letting go was harder than I ever imagined. My mother's house became both a refuge and a prison. She had always been my anchor, her strength a constant in my life, but even her warm presence couldn't completely shield me from the loneliness that crept in during the quiet moments. She tried her best to help, cooking my favorite meals, encouraging me to get out of the house, even suggesting I join a local support group for divorced men. At first, I balked at the idea. The thought of sitting in a circle and airing my dirty laundry to a group of strangers felt uncomfortable and unnecessary. But eventually, I gave in. The first meeting was awkward. I sat in the back, arms crossed, listening to men of all ages share their stories of heartbreak and betrayal. Some were angry, others despondent, but the common thread was that they all felt like their world had been pulled out from under them. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. What could I say that hadn't already been said? But when I finally found my voice, the words poured out like a flood. I told them about Emily, about Alex, about the life I thought I had and the one I was left with. And for the first time, I felt understood. These men didn't judge me or pity me. They just listened, nodding in recognition of a pain they knew all too well. The group became a lifeline. Through their stories, I began to see that I wasn't alone, that others had walked this path before me and come out the other side. It didn't make the pain go away, but it gave me a sense of hope that had been missing since the day my mother called with her devastating revelation. While I was piecing my life back together, Emily was navigating her own storm. She stayed in the house, a decision we had agreed upon for the kids' sake, but it quickly became clear that living there wasn't easy for her. Every room was a reminder of what we'd lost. Every photo on the wall a ghost of the life we'd once shared. She tried to make amends in her own way, attending therapy, writing letters she never sent, even volunteering at the kids' school to stay connected to them. But her relationship with Alex, as much as she tried to keep it separate from the rest of her life, was a constant source of tension. The kids were aware of his existence, though we both agreed not to introduce him formally until the dust had settled. Still, the thought of him stepping into their lives as some sort of father figure filled me with a bitterness I couldn't shake. Emily reached out occasionally, asking how I was doing, if there was anything she could do to make things easier. Her messages were careful, measured, as if she were walking on eggshells. I responded politely but kept my distance. I wasn't ready to forgive her, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. One afternoon, while picking the kids up from school, I ran into Alex. I hadn't been prepared for it, and the sight of him standing there, chatting with one of the teachers, sent a jolt of anger through me. He didn't see me at first, but when he did, his expression shifted. Not quite guilt, not quite defiance, but something in between. He extended a hand, as if we were old friends meeting by chance. I ignored it. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice low enough that the kids wouldn't hear. He hesitated but nodded, gesturing toward a bench a few feet away. Sitting across from him, I felt a surge of emotions I could barely contain. Anger, sadness, even curiosity. What kind of man inserts himself into another's family? What could he possibly say to justify what he'd done? "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, his voice calm but tinged with regret. I care about her, but I know how much pain this has caused. If I could go back and undo it, I would." His words did little to soothe the anger boiling inside me, but they forced me to see him as a human being rather than a villain. That didn't mean I forgave him. It just meant I could finally understand why Emily had been drawn to him, not as an excuse but as a piece of the puzzle. In the months that followed, life settled into a new kind of normal. Emily and I worked hard to create a stable environment for the kids, putting aside our differences for their sake. It wasn't always easy, but over time, the anger began to fade, replaced by a sense of acceptance. Our marriage was over, but our responsibilities as parents remained. I even started dating again, something I never thought I'd be ready for. It was awkward at first, like learning to walk after years of standing still. But the more I opened myself up to the possibility of love, the more I realized that my story wasn't over. Emily's betrayal had been a devastating chapter, but it didn't define me. I was more than a husband, more than a father. I was me, and for the first time in years, I was rediscovering what that meant. As for Emily, she and Alex eventually parted ways. Their relationship, built on the shaky foundation of deceit, couldn't withstand the weight of reality. She's still figuring out her path, just as I'm figuring out mine. And while I don't know what the future holds, I do know this. I've survived the worst of it and I'm still standing. That's enough for now. Time is a strange healer. It doesn't erase wounds or undo what's been done, but it softens the sharp edges of pain and fills in the gaps with something resembling acceptance. In the months following our separation, life found its new rhythm. The world kept spinning, the seasons changed, and the day-to-day demands of parenting became a balm for my restless mind. Emily and I settled into a fragile truce, bound together by our shared commitment to the kids and an unspoken understanding that we both wanted to move forward, albeit in different directions. The kids had adapted remarkably well. We established a co-parenting routine that worked for all of us. Alternating weekends, shared holidays, and regular check-ins to ensure we stayed on the same page about their needs. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of tension, miscommunications that led to arguments, and the occasional pang of jealousy when I saw them laughing with Emily during drop-offs. But overall, we managed. For their sake, we managed. As for Emily, she threw herself into rebuilding her life. After her relationship with Alex fizzled out, she began to focus on herself in ways I'd never seen before. She started taking yoga classes, joined a book club, and even signed up for an online course in creative writing. It was as if she were rediscovering who she was outside of the roles of wife and mother, carving out an identity that had nothing to do with me. I should have felt bitter watching her flourish, but instead, I felt something closer to relief. Her growth meant less guilt for me to carry. It meant she was finding her own path, one that no longer intersected with mine. For a long time, I avoided anything that reminded me of our old life together. The family photo albums stayed tucked away in a closet, our wedding album buried beneath them. Even the smell of Emily's favorite perfume, which lingered faintly in the house, was enough to send me into a spiral. But as the weeks turned into months, I found myself revisiting those memories, not with anger or sadness, but with a sense of quiet reflection. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, I stumbled upon a box of letters Emily and I had written to each other during the early years of our relationship. They were from a time when love felt new and boundless, when every word we exchanged was brimming with possibility. As I read through them, I realized how much we'd both changed. The couple in those letters wasn't the same as the people we'd become, and that was okay. It wasn't an indictment of our love but a testament to its impermanence. Love, like people, evolves. Sometimes it grows stronger and sometimes it fades. Ours had done both, and I could finally accept that. That evening, I called Emily. It wasn't a long conversation, just a simple exchange of gratitude. I thanked her for the good years, for the family we'd built together, and for the effort she was putting into co-parenting. She thanked me for being patient, for trying to understand, and for not letting bitterness consume me. It wasn't a resolution. The past still hurt, and forgiveness wasn't a destination I'd fully reached. But it was a step, a necessary one. As life continued, I began to rediscover myself. The support group I joined after the separation became a cornerstone of my healing journey. Through the stories of others, I found strength and perspective. I started running again, something I hadn't done since college, and the steady rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement became a form of meditation. I even dusted off my guitar, an old friend I'd neglected during the chaos of marriage and fatherhood. One evening, while playing a few chords on the porch, my neighbor Clara stopped by. She was a single mom, friendly but reserved, and we'd exchanged little more than pleasantries over the years. That night, she lingered, listening to the music and eventually striking up a conversation. We talked about everything and nothing, the challenges of parenting, favorite songs, and the absurdity of HOA meetings. It was the first time in a long time that I felt truly seen, not as someone's ex-husband or a co-parent, but as me. Clara and I started spending more time together. It wasn't a whirlwind romance or a dramatic love story. It was quiet and steady, built on mutual respect and shared experiences. She understood the complexities of my situation, and I respected the boundaries she set for her own. We took things slow, introducing our kids to each other gradually and allowing the relationship to grow organically. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace and possibility. Meanwhile, Emily had her own moment of clarity. One evening, during a routine exchange of the kids, she pulled me aside. Her demeanor was calm, her expression earnest. "I just want you to know," she said. "I'm truly sorry for everything. Not just for what I did but for how I made you feel, how I made you question yourself." Her words took me by surprise. Emily had apologized before, but this felt different. It wasn't laced with excuses or attempts to shift blame. It was sincere, unguarded, and it struck a chord I didn't realize I'd been waiting to hear. "I'm working on forgiving myself," she continued, "but I hope you can find it in you to forgive me too. Not for us to go back, just so we can both move forward." I nodded, too choked up to respond in the moment. Forgiveness is a process, not an event, but her words planted a seed. Over time, I found myself letting go of the anger I'd been holding on to. It didn't mean I forgot what happened or that it didn't still hurt, but it meant I no longer let that hurt define me. Years later, our lives look very different. Emily and I have become amicable co-parents, navigating birthdays and graduations with a newfound ease. Clara and I have built a life together that feels both steady and joyful, a blend of our pasts and the future we're creating. The kids are thriving, their laughter a reminder that even in the wake of pain, joy is possible. Looking back, I realized that Emily's betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was a chapter, one filled with heartbreak and lessons I never wanted to learn but needed to. It forced me to confront my own flaws, to reevaluate what I wanted from life and love, and to find strength I didn't know I had. Sometimes, the unexpected ending isn't about grand gestures or dramatic resolutions. It's about finding peace in the chaos, about learning to let go and make room for something new. And that, I think, is the real twist. Not that life moves on, but that it can move on beautifully, even when it feels like everything has fallen apart.